The house was quiet, but it wasn't a lonely kind of quiet. It was the peaceful stillness that comes from years of making a home. I could hear the low hum of the refrigerator and the distant ticking of the clock in the hallway. For 45 years, this house had been my sanctuary. I sat in my favorite armchair by the window. The sunlight caught the dust motes dancing in the air. On the side table sat a small cake with a few candles, just enough for me and my husband's memory. I loved my family more than anything. They were the reason I had built this life. My children grew up within these walls. They found their own ways, but they always came home. Or at least, that was what I told myself every morning when I made coffee for them in the years before they moved away. I am a mother. I am a grandmother. I am the person people call when things fall apart. In our family, I have always been the anchor. The one who keeps everyone steady when the waves get too high. It was my 65th birthday today. A milestone. I didn't need much, just a quiet evening and the company of those I loved. There was a knock at the door. It wasn't the usual knock from the kids. It was firm. Purposeful. I stood up, my joints giving a small protest, and opened the door. "Happy birthday, Mom," Sarah said. She was holding a large, heavy box wrapped in deep navy paper. She looked different lately. Tighter around the eyes. But she gave me that smile I had seen every day for decades. "It's beautiful, honey." She set it down on the hall table. "We wanted to give you something substantial. Something special." I took a moment to look at her. She was my eldest. My protector. Later that evening, after they left, I sat with the box in my lap. It felt heavy. Not just physically, it was weighted with something else. A tension I couldn't quite name but could certainly feel. I unwrapped the paper. The tissue paper beneath was crinkled and old. I pulled out a small wooden box. Inside sat a silver brooch, delicate and intricate. It looked like it had been in someone's jewelry box for a very long time. It was beautiful. But as I held it, my hands trembled slightly. The weight of the gift felt wrong. It felt like it carried a secret. I noticed something else tucked underneath the velvet lining of the small box. A piece of paper. It wasn't an invitation or a card from one of the children. It was a single, heavy sheet of stationery. The handwriting was shaky but recognizable. I pulled it out and unfolded it. My heart skipped a beat. The name at the top of the page made the room feel suddenly cold. It was a letter from someone who shouldn't have been in contact with us for years. Someone who didn't belong in my house, or in my life. I stared at the words on the page. My fingers gripped the paper until it wrinkled. I hadn't expected anything today but peace. Instead, I was holding a ghost from the past. The realization hit me like a physical weight. This wasn't just a gift. It was an intrusion. I looked at the door they had walked through hours ago. They didn't know. Or perhaps, they did, and they were watching to see what I would do next. My breath hitched in my throat. The letter began with a single sentence that changed everything. "You can't keep the secret forever. You can't keep the secret forever." The words were printed on cheap paper, but they felt heavy in my hands. I read them over and over again until the ink seemed to blur before my eyes. I sat in the silence of my living room, the only light coming from a small lamp near the armchair. The house was still, but my heart was racing. It wouldn't stop. The letter didn't just contain a message, it contained a contradiction. It spoke of property lines and unresolved obligations. It mentioned things I had been told were settled decades ago. Things that were supposed to be part of the past, buried under layers of time and family pride. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my hands. In our family, we always stayed together. We held on to what was ours with a grip so tight it sometimes left bruises. I had spent 40 years protecting this house, these memories, and the people inside them. But as I read further into the letter, the ground seemed to shift beneath me. The author of the note claimed that certain documents were missing. From the official county records. They suggested that the true ownership of the estate hadn't been properly signed over in 1984. That was the year my brother had walked away. The year we were told he had chosen his own path, leaving our family behind to find a life of his own. We hadn't seen him since. He was a ghost story told at Thanksgiving. A name we barely spoke aloud anymore. But why would someone from that time be reaching out now? And why would they mention those specific documents? I stood up and walked to the mahogany desk in the corner of the room. I pulled out an old ledger, one I hadn't touched in years. It contained the records I had kept for every renovation, every tax payment, every repair. It was my Bible. My way of ensuring everything stayed perfect. I began to cross-reference the dates mentioned in the letter with my own notes. The more I looked, the more the inconsistencies stood out like thorns in a garden. There were gaps in the records. Small, almost invisible omissions that, when placed together, painted a picture of something deliberate. It wasn't just an error. It was a concealment. I felt a chill crawl down my spine. Someone had been working on this. They had been planning this for a long time. My mind raced back to the conversations with my children over the last few years. They had talked about simplifying things. They had talked about modernizing the estate. I had listened, thinking it was just their way of expressing a desire for less maintenance. Now, those words began to sound like something else. A strategy. A slow, calculated move toward a goal I couldn't yet see. I reached the end of the page and my breath hitched. There, at the very bottom, was a signature. It wasn't a name, not exactly. It was a notation for an address that hadn't been used in years. And beneath it, written in the same frantic script as the opening line, was a single name. Julian. My heart skipped a beat. Julian. That was the name of the man my daughter-in-law had once mentioned in passing. She told me he was an old family friend, who helped with the legalities of our transition. I never questioned it because she seemed so capable, so kind. But I knew that name from a different time. A much darker time. Julian wasn't a friend. He was the man my brother had been involved with before he disappeared. The man who was supposed to be out of our lives forever. I sat back down in my chair, the wood groaning under my weight. The name on that paper wasn't just a stranger's identity. It was a piece of a puzzle I didn't know I was trying to solve. And it meant that the person who sent this letter knew exactly what they were doing. They weren't just looking for information, they were sending me a warning. Julian. The name hung in the air like a heavy fog. I whispered it to myself, and the sound of my own voice startled me. It felt wrong to say it out loud. I sat in the silence for a long time, staring at that piece of paper. My heart hammered against my ribs. Everything changed with one name. If Julian was involved, then this wasn't just some mistake by a clerk or a misunderstanding between my children. This was something older. Something deeper. I couldn't sit still anymore. The anxiety was clawing at the back of my throat. I needed to know what his involvement meant for us, for me. I stood up and walked toward the basement. It was a place I rarely visited these days, but it held the bones of our history. The air downstairs was cool and smelled of dust and old paper. This was where I kept the real files. The ones from before the kids moved in to help with the management of the estate. I pulled a heavy plastic bin from under the stairs. It was filled with folders, many of them dated back decades. They were my records. My proof. I began to sort through them, looking for anything related to the land and the title. I needed to see what the official transition looked like before anyone else had their hands on it. My hands trembled as I flipped through pages of old deeds and local tax assessments. I found the primary deed from the 90s. It was clear. It was solid. It showed my name and my late husband's name. But then, I started looking at the subsequent amendments. The updates that had been made over the years. The paper began to feel thinner. As I went further back. Not the physical paper, the logic of it. There were entries from a few years ago. Small adjustments to the property lines. Minor corrections to the legal descriptions. They were signed by my son and my daughter-in-law. They seemed like routine maintenance at first. But then I noticed something that made my stomach turn over. Every time a new document was filed, a specific law firm's name appeared in the margins. A firm I didn't recognize. A firm that wasn't the one we had used for 40 years. I pulled out an old, leather-bound binder, the one containing the original survey from the day we bought the house. It was my most prized possession. It sat on a workbench, and I opened it to the final page. There was a rider, a small legal addendum tucked into the back pocket of the folder. It was dated only months ago. I pulled it out and felt the breath leave my lungs. It wasn't just an amendment for a fence or a driveway. It was a conditional grant. A shadow clause that gave someone else, a third party, temporary rights to the primary residence under specific circumstances of hardship or insolvency. I looked at the signature on that specific document. It wasn't my children's handwriting. It was Julian's name, printed in a sharp, professional script. And beneath it, there was a stamp from the county clerk, a stamp that confirmed the clause had been accepted as part of the current ownership structure. My hands shook so much I almost dropped the paper. They weren't just making changes to the yard or the roof. They were carving out pieces of my home while I sat in it, thinking they were protecting me. The realization hit me like a physical blow. Julian wasn't just an old friend of mine's son's. He was the architect of a trap. I looked at the date on that final stamp. It was signed only 3 months ago. While my daughter-in-law sat across from me at dinner, telling me how much she loved the house. They were moving the goalposts while I wasn't looking. They were building a cage out of paper and ink. I looked back at the piece of paper in my hand, the one with Julian's name on it. It was linked directly to the current deed of my home. It wasn't just an old secret. It was a live wire, and I had just touched it. I sat in that dimly lit room with the papers spread out across my lap like a map of a country I no longer recognized. The document wasn't just a piece of paper anymore, it was a confession. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my shaking hands. I needed to know what this meant legally. If there was a clause for hardship, who defined hardship? What were the terms of that transition? I reached for my phone and called an old friend, a man named Miller who had handled our estate for decades before he retired. He was a straight shooter, someone who dealt in facts rather than family feelings. "Arthur?" I said when he finally answered. My voice sounded thin even to my own ears. "I need you to look at something very specific." He didn't ask questions. He knew the gravity of a call like this. I described the clause and the signature. I told him about the shadow title and the way it was woven into our primary deed. When he listened, his silence on the other end of the line felt heavy. It wasn't the silence of a man thinking, it was the silence of a man hearing something impossible. "If that clause is active," Miller said finally, "then the ownership isn't just being shared. It's being staged." I sat back until my spine hit the chair. Staged. That was the word. He explained how these clauses were often used in commercial real estate to facilitate a transition of power when an owner was deemed unable to manage the property. It wasn't about me being physically unable. It was about the legal definition of my presence becoming negotiable. The realization hit me like a physical blow. They weren't just trying to simplify things for me. They were preparing the ground to move me out. They were making sure that if I ever became too much or not enough in their eyes, there was a legal mechanism already in place to replace me. I began to look through the files of the last 5 years again, searching for every instance of my daughter-in-law's signature on official documents. I had always thought she was helping me keep things current. I thought her involvement was about preservation. But as I tracked the dates, a pattern emerged that turned my blood cold. She hadn't just signed once or twice. She had been signing nearly every revision of our property filing since 2019. Every time there was a minor update to the zoning or an insurance renewal, her name appeared alongside mine as a co-coordinator. It wasn't a gradual transition. It was a consistent, methodical accumulation of power over my own home. She hadn't been managing the house for me. She had been documenting my replacement. I looked at a folder from 3 years ago. A small note in the margin, written in her neat, precise script, asterisk, ensuring long-term stability. Asterisk, they weren't just preparing for the future. They were manufacturing it. She wasn't just a daughter-in-law looking out for an aging mother-in-law. She was the architect of a multi-year plan to dismantle my role in this house, one signature at a time. I looked at the papers again. The scale of the coordination was staggering. It wasn't a sudden betrayal today. It was a long game that had started years ago. The realization finally crystallized in my mind, cold and sharp as glass. My daughter-in-law hadn't just stumbled into this situation. She had orchestrated every step of it, methodically preparing the ground to push me out while I still thought she was holding my hand. The knowledge sat in my stomach like lead. It was heavy, cold, and it made every breath feel slightly harder than it had before. I didn't want to look any further. I wanted to pull the blankets over my head and pretend that the truth was just a ghost I'd imagined in the attic. If I stopped looking now, maybe the peace would come back. Maybe I could go back to being the matriarch who only worried about garden beds and grandkids. But the silence of the house felt different now. It didn't feel like a sanctuary anymore, it felt like an ambush. It was becoming clear that this wasn't just one person's mistake. A single misunderstanding wouldn't leave such a trail. This was a coordinated effort, a series of deliberate choices made by people I trusted to keep me safe. I spent the afternoon in my home office, the only room where they hadn't managed to tidy up my life just yet. It was filled with papers and files that belonged to my tenure here, the records of 40 years. I began to look into the collaboration. I looked for any evidence that anyone else beyond my daughter-in-law was involved in these changes. The more I dug, the more the scope of the betrayal grew. It wasn't just a family matter anymore, it was an organized transaction. I found records of communications with legal firms and property management groups that had been active for over 3 years. They weren't talking about home repairs or safety upgrades. They were using clinical, almost transactional language to discuss my long-term viability as the primary resident. They weren't talking about me like a person. They were talking about me as a risk factor in their investment. The fear of finding out more began to compete with the dread of staying ignorant. I knew that if I saw too much, there would be no way to unsee it. There would be no going back to my life of blissful ignorance. But the suspicion had already poisoned my peace. I couldn't just sit in a house where the floorboards were being replaced with traps while I slept. I felt like an intruder in my own history, watching them move pieces on a board I didn't even know was being played. They weren't trying to help me adjust to aging. They were preparing for the moment I became difficult to manage. They had calculated exactly how much patience they were willing to offer before they activated their contingency plans. I found an old binder that held my original deeds and property lines from the 70s. It was my anchor, the physical proof of my ownership. It sat on a drafting table in the back, and I pulled out a small, folded piece of paper from its hidden pocket. It was a document signed only months ago. It wasn't an amendment for something simple like a fence or a driveway. It was a power of appointment clause, a legal mechanism that allowed them to bypass my signature if they could prove I was no longer in a position to make decisions for myself. The date on the paper was chillingly recent. They weren't waiting for me to become ill. They were simply waiting for it to be convenient. It wasn't just a plan, it was a roadmap of my exclusion. I sat back, my breath hitching in the quiet room. I realized that they had been building this wall around me for years, brick by brick, signature by signature. Every helpful conversation about downsizing or simplifying was just them testing my boundaries to see how much I'd accept before I started asking questions. The realization was heavy. They didn't want a partner in the next chapter of our family life. They wanted an heir who didn't know she'd already been disinherited from her own home. Then, I noticed something else. Tucked into the back of that binder, hidden by a strip of tape, was a second piece of paper. It wasn't just about me or the house. It was a list of contacts and emergency exit plans for when the transition became necessary. It contained instructions on how to manage my relocation if the legal timeline reached its peak. I saw the names of 3 other people from my own social circle, who were listed as authorized facilitators. My blood ran cold. They weren't just collaborating with each other. They had recruited others into the circle, turning a family secret into a community consensus. The most terrifying part was the final note at the bottom of that second paper. It wasn't dated months ago. It was dated for next month. They always told me that life was getting harder for me to manage. They said it was because of my age, or my health, or just the general wear and tear of staying in a large house alone. They called it protection. They called it looking out for my best interests. But as I sat among the boxes of my past, those words began to sound like a script they had been reciting for years. I went into the attic, the one place that felt truly mine. It was dusty and smelled of old cedar and forgotten memories. This is where the things that were too hard to keep in the main house ended up. I spent hours going through folders from 5, 10, even 15 years ago. It was like digging through a garden that had been slowly being overgrown by weeds. I had to pull back the layers of their help to see what was underneath. Every time I found an old document, it felt like a brick falling away from a wall. That had been protecting me. Or perhaps it was a wall they had built around me. I looked at a series of emails from a decade ago regarding the property taxes and insurance. They were addressed to my son. In the threads, he wasn't talking about help. He was talking about mitigation and risk management. He didn't sound like a son trying to help his mother pay her bills. He sounded like a manager preparing for an inevitable vacancy. It made me wonder how many times I had sat at the dinner table while they discussed my future as if it were a logistical problem to be solved. I realized then that their protection was really just a long-term strategy. They weren't keeping me safe from the world, they were shielding themselves from the burden of me. The more I dug, the more my own memories started to feel like shadows. I tried to remember conversations we'd had about these issues. Every time I tried to recall them, I heard their voices, soft, comforting, and utterly dishonest. They would tell me it was just a small adjustment. They'd say they were only trying to lighten my load. But the papers told a different story. The paper didn't lie. It showed that every small adjustment was part of a larger, coordinated plan. They weren't reacting to my needs, they were anticipating my absence. I felt a hollow ache in my chest as I realized how much I had missed while being looked after. I hadn't been the center of their concern, I had been the obstacle in their path. Then, I found the oldest box at the very back of the attic. It was labeled Household Records, Archive. Inside was a small, digital recorder, an old model with buttons that were slightly faded from use. It wasn't mine. Or it hadn't been for a long time. I pressed the button. The tape hissed, and then I heard them. It was my son and my daughter-in-law. The recording was dated 4 years ago, a time when I was still healthy enough to manage everything without any help at all. "We have to start moving the pieces now," my daughter-in-law's voice came through, sharp and clinical. "If we wait until she gets older, it'll be too hard to untangle the legalities." My son sighed on the other end of the line. "No. But we have to do it slowly. She can't suspect anything. We just keep telling her it's about simplifying things for her sake." The recording ended with a heavy silence. It wasn't a disagreement they were having. It was a pact. They hadn't started this protection recently. They hadn't even started it when the first problems arose. They had decided to plan my displacement before I ever knew anything was wrong. The air in the house felt thick, as if it were weighted with things left unsaid. Every time I heard a floorboard creak or a door click, I found myself jumping, my heart racing against my ribs. I wasn't sure who to trust anymore. Even the familiar furniture seemed to hold different secrets now. I decided I couldn't sit in this silence forever. I needed to know where I stood. I needed to see if there was any part of them that was still just family. I chose a moment when only my daughter-in-law, Sarah, was in the kitchen. She was preparing tea, her movements precise and practiced. It was a ritual we had shared for years. "Sarah," I said, my voice sounding steadier than I felt. "Can we talk for a moment?" She stopped what she was doing and turned to me. Her expression was unreadable. For a heartbeat, I saw a flash of something in her eyes. Fear? Or maybe just recognition. "Of course, Mother," she said softly. She set down the kettle. I walked toward her, my heart hammering a steady rhythm against my ribs. I sat across from her at the small kitchen table, the very same one where we had shared countless laughs and quiet moments of comfort over the years. I didn't lead with an accusation. Instead, I spoke about something small. A piece of furniture, or a detail in the garden. "I was looking through some old papers today," I began, keeping my voice low. "In the back of the hall closet." She went very still. It was as if the name of that specific place, the heart of my records, was a tripwire. I didn't stop. I found some notes about the property. Some things were mentioned that I hadn't seen before. Things about the long-term plans. The air in the kitchen seemed to grow colder instantly. Sarah's hand gripped the edge of the table. Her knuckles turned white. She didn't look away, but her face became a mask of composure. "You shouldn't have been looking through those folders, Mother," she said. It wasn't a warning, it was a fact. The words hit me like a physical blow. It was the first time she had ever told me not to do something out of fear for my safety. I watched her closely as I spoke. "What does long-term plans mean, Sarah? Is this about my care? Or is it about something else?" She took a breath, her shoulders tensing. She didn't answer immediately. For those few seconds, the silence was filled with the heavy weight of what she wasn't saying. "It's about your safety," she finally whispered. "We just want to make sure everything is taken care of before something happens." But her eyes told a different story. They weren't looking at me with love or concern. They were calculating my response, gauging how much I had truly discovered. I realized then that she wasn't trying to protect me from the world. She was protecting their plan from me. The realization felt like a slow-burning fire in my chest. Every shared meal and every kind word seemed tainted by this hidden agenda. "And who else is involved?" I asked, the words barely leaving my lips. "Who helped you with these plans?" She didn't answer. She couldn't. The question hung between us like a ghost. Just as the tension became almost unbearable, I heard a footstep in the hallway. It wasn't the familiar heavy step of my son. It was lighter, more deliberate. A man stepped into the kitchen doorway. He looked out of place in our home, his suit slightly rumpled but his presence commanding. "Is there a problem?" he asked. His voice was calm and professional, yet it carried an underlying tone of authority that sent a chill down my spine. I looked at him, and then back at Sarah. They weren't alone. The circle was wider than I had ever imagined. "I was just telling your mother how we can simplify the transition," he said, walking toward the table. We were trying to help. The house felt different today. It wasn't just the preparation for the dinner, it was the weight of what I had uncovered hiding in the shadows of its hallways. I spent the afternoon moving through the rooms, my hands shaking as I adjusted the placement of a vase or straightened a photo frame. Every gesture felt like a performance. I was preparing for an audience that didn't know they were being watched. They were planning a celebration. They were telling everyone, my children, their spouses, even our friends, that it was a night to honor my years as the heart of this family. But for me, it felt like a rehearsal. I stood in the kitchen, watching my hands as they gripped the edge of the counter. I kept seeing those legal documents in my mind. The shadow clauses. The emergency exit plans. They weren't just words on paper, they were a countdown. Every time my phone chimed with a message from my daughter-in-law, asking about the centerpiece or the menu, I felt a pang of betrayal. She was using the same voice she used to tell me she loved me. It was a smooth, practiced tone that now sounded like a veil. I realized then how much was at stake. If I stayed silent, they would move forward with their plan. They would slowly strip away my autonomy until I was just a guest in my own home, eventually moved to some simpler place for my benefit. If I spoke up, the peace of the dinner would shatter. The truth would come out like a jagged stone thrown into a still pond. I looked at the invitation on the counter. It was beautiful and elegant. It was a masterpiece of deception. It wasn't just about a piece of property anymore. It was about my identity. They weren't trying to help me navigate aging, they were managing me like an asset that was becoming harder to maintain. I began to make a list in my mind, the things I needed to say. The questions I had to ask. I had to find out who else knew. How many of our friends were actually part of Julian's circle? How deep did the rot go? The fear was a cold stone in my chest. It wasn't just the fear of losing my house, it was the fear of realizing how little I trusted the people I loved most. I took a long breath and looked at the reflection of myself in the microwave door. I looked like a woman who knew nothing. I looked like someone who still believed that family meant something beyond what could be signed on a deed. They were coming tonight to celebrate my 65th year. They would offer me wine and tell me how proud they were of the life I had built. They would smile for the photos, while their minds were already calculating the next phase of my transition. I spent the evening preparing my defense. Not a physical one, but a mental one. I had to find a way to speak without causing a scene, yet with enough clarity that they couldn't ignore me. I had to let them know I saw the seams in the cloth. But as the sun began to set, casting long, orange shadows across the floor, I noticed something new on the kitchen table. It was a small, formal-looking envelope left by the courier earlier that afternoon. It wasn't addressed to me. It was for the residents. I opened it with trembling fingers. Inside was not a letter of celebration or a simple thank you from one of the guests. It was an official notice from the county clerk, dated just 3 days ago. It wasn't about a title search or a survey update. It was a formal intent to file for the very clauses I had found in my study. The date they planned to file the final documents wasn't months away. It was scheduled for the morning after the dinner. The candles were lit, and the table was set with heavy china and silver that had belonged to my mother. It should have been a night of celebration. Instead, it felt like a walk toward a precipice. My son sat across from me, his face glowing in the warm light. He looked like the same boy who used to hide behind my skirts when he was afraid of thunderstorms. Beside him, Sarah smiled as she poured wine. It was a piece of practiced, elegant smile that didn't quite reach her eyes anymore. I looked at them both, and then I reached into my pocket. My hand felt heavy, like I were holding a piece of hot coal. I pulled out the letter, the one with Julian's name at the bottom. I placed it on the table between us. My voice was steady, but it felt thick in my throat. I found something, I said softly. I found some notes about the property. Some things were mentioned that I hadn't seen before. Things about the long-term plans. The silence that followed was immediate and sharp. It wasn't a normal pause in conversation, it was a sudden drop in temperature. Sarah's hand gripped the edge of the table. Her knuckles turned white. She didn't look away, but her face became a mask of composure. "You're probably just looking at some complex legal jargon, Mom," she said quickly. "Sometimes the paperwork is messy. It doesn't mean anything personal." I didn't look at her. I looked at my son. "It isn't just a mess, David. It's a plan. A long one." My son's smile stiffened. He set his glass down with a controlled click against the tabletop. "What did you find, Mom?" he asked. His voice was too calm. It was the tone of a man who was prepared for an answer he wasn't hoping to hear. I told him about the shadow clauses. I spoke about the power of appointment. I talked about the transition plans and the way they had been moving pieces for years while I thought we were just discussing repairs and renovations. I realized then how much was at stake. If I stayed silent, they would move forward with their plan. They would slowly strip away my autonomy until I was just a guest in my own home, eventually moved to some simpler place for my benefit. If I spoke up, the peace of the dinner would shatter. The truth would come out like a jagged stone thrown into a still pond. I looked at the invitation on the counter. It was beautiful and elegant. It was a masterpiece of deception. It wasn't just about a piece of property anymore. It was about my identity. They weren't trying to help me navigate aging, they were managing me like an asset that was becoming harder to maintain. I began to make a list in my mind, the things I needed to say. The questions I had to ask. I had to find out who else knew. How many of our friends were actually part of Julian's circle? How deep did the rot go? The fear was a cold stone in my chest. It wasn't just the fear of losing my house, it was the fear of realizing how little I trusted the people I loved most. I took a long breath and looked at the reflection of myself in the mirror. I looked like a woman who knew nothing. I looked like someone who still believed that family meant something beyond what could be signed on a deed. They were coming tonight to celebrate my 65th year. They would offer me wine and tell me how proud they were of the life I had built. They would smile for the photos, while their minds were already calculating the next phase of my transition. I spent the evening preparing my defense. Not a physical one, but a mental one. I had to find a way to speak without causing a scene, yet with enough clarity that they couldn't ignore me. I had to let them know I saw the seams in the cloth. But as the sun began to set, casting long, orange shadows across the floor, I noticed something new on the table. It was a small, formal-looking envelope left by the courier earlier that afternoon. It wasn't addressed to me. It was for the residents. I opened it with trembling fingers. Inside was not a letter of celebration or a simple thank you from one of the guests. It was an official notice from the county clerk, dated just 3 days ago. It wasn't about a title search or a survey update. It was a formal intent to file for the very clauses I had found in my study. The date they planned to file the final documents wasn't months away. It was scheduled for the morning after the dinner. The dinner was a blur of forced smiles and polite conversation, but the air in the room felt heavy, like it was filled with unexploded charges. My children were there, their faces glowing with pride as they toasted to my 65th year. They seemed so happy to be together. But I could see the way they looked at me. It wasn't just love anymore. It was a calculation of what was left and how much time remained. I sat in my chair, feeling like an observer at my own life's table. Every laugh from my son felt hollow. Every compliment from Sarah felt like a script being read perfectly for the audience. Then came the moment of reckoning. The guest list had been small, but it was enough to make me realize how deep the collusion went. The friends who showed up were some of those I'd spoken with about my difficulties. They weren't here to celebrate a birthday, they were there as witnesses to a transition. I watched them. They moved around the house like they owned it already, making adjustments, taking notes on their phones, and nodding at each other in ways that had nothing to do with family. The wine was flowing freely. The questions were getting harder. "You've done so much for this family," my son said, leaning in close. He held my hand, his grip firm enough to be almost uncomfortable. "We just want to make sure the future is secure." It was the moment. They weren't talking about the next year of my life, they were talking about the transfer of power. I looked at them both and let out a slow breath. I didn't yell. I didn't scream. I simply laid it all on the table, just like I had planned. I told them what I found in the attic. I showed them the shadow clauses and the intent to file that would strip my authority over my own home. The reaction was instantaneous. The room went cold. My son's grip on my hand tightened until it hurt. Sarah's smile didn't just falter, it vanished completely, leaving her face pale and sharp. They weren't surprised to find out I knew. They were only angry that I hadn't stayed quiet for longer. "It isn't about power," my son stammered, his voice cracking. "It's about protection. We can't let you be overwhelmed by the bills and the maintenance." "I am not a burden to be managed, David," I said, my voice steady but hard as stone. "You are talking about a legal maneuver to remove me from the title of this house." Sarah stepped forward, her eyes gleaming with something that wasn't kindness. "It's just a safety net, Mom. We were only trying to make things easier for you before it became an emergency. The fact that there is an intent to file tomorrow morning tells me it isn't a plan for the future," I said. "It's a heist happening in real time." I looked at them both, and finally, the mask fell away completely. They weren't my children in that moment, they were partners in a business deal. They stopped pretending to be worried about my safety. They began to argue with each other about how much leverage I still had left. The conversation shifted from comfort to strategy. They started discussing the timeline of the papers, the role of the legal firm, and how quickly they could finalize the transition if I didn't fight it. It was like watching a corporate takeover happen in my dining room. They were trying to negotiate with me as if I were a seller, not a mother. They were trying to find the point where I would finally break and give them what they wanted just so the fighting would stop. I realized then that they weren't even sorry for what they'd done. They were merely frustrated that I was making it difficult for them to finish what they had started. The dinner ended not with a toast, but with a cold silence of calculation. Then, a piece of paper fell from Sarah's pocket as she moved toward the door. It wasn't just another legal document. It was a copy of my own medical records, marked in red with several declines and concerns. They hadn't been trying to convince me I was struggling, they were waiting for the medical system to do it for them so they could move in legally. They hadn't been trying to convince me I was struggling, they were waiting for the medical system to do it for them so they could move in legally. I saw her look down at the paper and quickly snatch it up, but it was too late. The truth of their timeline was written on every page. She didn't even have to speak. The decision had already been made by someone else before I even walked through the front door today. Pause for impact. The aftermath of the confrontation was a cold, hollow ache in my chest. The dinner had ended, and the guests had dispersed like ghosts into the night, leaving me alone with the wreckage of my expectations. My house felt different now. It didn't feel like a sanctuary anymore, it felt like a crime scene. I sat in the kitchen, staring at the empty chair where Sarah had sat while she spoke to me with that hollow, scripted kindness. I realized then that they weren't just trying to help me. They were managing my exit. The silence of the house was no longer peaceful. It was heavy with the weight of what I now knew. Their intent wasn't about my well-being, but about the acquisition of something they felt entitled to. I spent the next few hours in a daze, pacing the hallways. Every room held a memory, and every memory seemed tainted by the betrayal. The guest room where we shared coffee, the hallway where I watched my children grow, every inch was now marked by their secret collaboration. I looked at the legal papers on the table one last time before the sun began to rise. They weren't just plans, they were a countdown. A ticking clock that had been running for years while I sat in blissful ignorance, believing they were my protectors. They weren't my children in those moments of negotiation. They were partners in a business transaction, and I was the final hurdle they needed to clear. The realization was a physical blow to my chest. It wasn't just that they were doing something wrong, it was that they had done it with a chilling sense of purpose. They didn't want me to feel better, they wanted me to yield. I decided then that I couldn't wait for them to make the next move. If I sat still, I would be swallowed by their narrative of my declining health and my need for simpler living. I had to find a way to stand firm. Not just as a mother, but as an owner. As a woman who knew her worth. But the truth was harder than any plan. Knowing what they were doing meant I couldn't ever go back to the way things were. There was no going back to the dinner table of trust and easy laughter. I spent the night in the study, surrounded by my own records. It was my fortress now. My only defense against their impending legal siege. Every time I thought about calling them, I heard Sarah's voice, that steady, calculated tone she used when discussing transition. They wouldn't listen to my feelings. They would only see my resistance as a sign that I wasn't aware of the situation. They were waiting for me to break so they could step in as the savior. I had to find something they couldn't argue against. A truth that was undeniable. Something that would force them to stop their maneuvers and face what they had done. Then, I found a discrepancy in the latest deed update, a small, odd detail in the signature. Block of the current contract. It wasn't just Sarah's name there. There was a second signature from several months ago. A signature that didn't belong to my son or any of our family friends. I pulled up the full document and cross-referenced it with the previous filings. It was a recurring signature, appearing on every major change since 2019. It wasn't just a local firm's attorney. It was an official mark from a trust company I hadn't even known existed. I realized then that they weren't just trying to get me out of the house. They were building something much larger than just my residence. They had been creating a structure that didn't include me at all. The realization hit me like a cold wave. This wasn't just about who lived here. It was about what they intended to do with the land itself. And then I noticed the date of the most recent signature. It hadn't been signed by Sarah or my son today. It had been signed and timestamped in our own kitchen, barely a week ago. They hadn't just planned for the future, they were already executing it while I was still sitting at their table. The next morning, the sun rose over my property with a clarity I hadn't felt in months. It was as if a heavy fog had lifted from the glass of my windows. I sat on my porch and watched the light move across the grass. For 40 years, this land had been my anchor. Now, it was something more. It was a fortress of memory and personal choice. I realized then that their silence at dinner wasn't just a lack of words, it was a wall they had built to keep me out. They hadn't meant to hurt me, they were simply trying to manage me like an asset. But I was no longer looking for their permission to stay. I took the documents from my desk and made one call. It was to the head of the firm that had been handling our land records since the 90s. I didn't need a long explanation. I just needed them to know who held the primary authority. I want these options rescinded, I told the man, my voice steady. No more shadow clauses. No more transition plans. I am staying exactly where I am. He was silent for a moment. Then he sighed. And I could hear it in his breath. He knew the law. More importantly, he knew that I held the primary deed in my hands. The deal wasn't just their secret, it was a choice they had made to trade my trust for their convenience. They had thought I was too old to see the difference between a gift and a trap. They were wrong. A few days later, the house was quiet again. It was the honest silence of a sanctuary. My son and his wife arrived that afternoon. They looked tired, their eyes scanning my face for signs of what they might call fatigue. They sat in the kitchen, and for the first time in months, the air didn't feel charged with hidden agendas. It just felt heavy with truth. "We just wanted to make things easier for you," my son said, his voice thick with regret. He looked at me, really seeing me for once. "We were afraid you wouldn't be able to handle the upkeep alone." I looked at him and saw the boy who used to hide behind my skirts when he was scared of the dark. "You didn't have to choose a shortcut, David," I said softly. "A shortcut through my life isn't help anymore. It is a theft of my agency." They sat in silence for a long time. The reality of what they had done, and what they were still trying to do, finally settled between us like dust on the furniture. I didn't need to offer them an apology, and I wouldn't take one from them. They hadn't meant to be villains, they had just been too afraid to let me stay independent. "I appreciate your concern," I said firmly. "But if you want to help me, do it by being present. Not by planning my absence." They looked shocked. Then, slowly, the tension began to drain from their faces. They were no longer trying to manage a situation, they were just sitting with their mother. I watched them leave that evening. They were still my children, but they would never again be my keepers. The house grew quiet as I locked the door. It was the familiar, steady pulse of a home that belonged only to me. I sat in my chair by the window and let the twilight settle over the room. I didn't look at the papers on the desk. Or the contracts in the file. I just listened to the house breathe. It was a simple realization, I hadn't lost anything of value. I had only found what remained. I held my tea, feeling its warmth against my palms. The past was settled. The threat was gone. The house was silent, a true, honest silence. The house was silent, a true, honest silence. I was home. I was whole.